Over the past few weeks, I've been playing around with the Micro Swiss NG Extruder. This is their brand new dual gear direct drive all metal Hotend combo with a 3:1 gear ratio. The NG was first teased late last year, and I have been looking forward to getting my hands on it. Micro Swiss reached out with interest in sponsoring an install video for the NG Extruder, so that is what we're going to be doing today. In this video, we'll be converting an Ender 3 V2 from the stock plastic Bowden extruder and PTFE lined Hotend to this new dual gear direct drive Hotend extruder combo. Although we are specifically doing this install on the Ender 3 V2, the process will be very similar for a wide range of Creality machines and Ender 3 style clones. So with all that being said and without further ado, let's get right into today's video. Before starting with the install, let's run through the box and take a look at all the parts, so that way you've got a bit of familiarity with what is included in this kit. Inside you'll find the extruder extension cable that will need to expand upon the printer's current extruder cable, a bag that has the self-tapping fan screws, a couple of tools, PTFE fitting and retention clips, a bag that has the roller wheel bolts, a washer, a lock nut, and eccentric nut that we'll need for the new extruder carriage, another bag that has the heater block with a silicone sock and thermistor screw. Both the nozzle and heat brake are already installed and they've been tightened to spec at factory. And of course we have the main extruder body with the pre-installed fan shroud. Make sure that you've got everything included with your kit and then put these off to the side. We won't be needing them just this second. The first step will be to take our Ender 3 V2 and remove the existing extruder and Hotend. Before we do that, if you are planning on installing a BL Touch or CR Touch, Micro Swiss does have STL files that you'll want to print out that I'll have linked in the description. They also let me know that the fan shroud that is included on the extruder will have an available STL, so when that does become available, I will have that linked as well in the description of this video. The first step is to remove the current housing for the Hotend as well as the fans. To do this, we'll turn the Ender 3 V2 around so that we have access to the two screws on the back. We'll need to remove both the screw on the right side, which is the one actually holding it to the back plate, as well as the one on the left side, which is holding the blower fan in place. Micro Swiss does include all new screws for the extruder, but I still went ahead and kept all of these screws off to the side just to have in case. Now that we've got those two screws removed, we'll turn the printer around so that way we have access to the front. We'll start by grabbing some flush cutters and removing the zip tie on the cable braid. And then to remove the housing, if you sort of pivot and wiggle it to the right side, you'll be able to pop it off. Now that we have the Hotend exposed, we'll need to remove the silicone sock that will give us access to the thermistor and heater cartridge. I recommend raising up the X carriage just a little bit so that way you've got easier access to the tiny set screw on the bottom of the heater block. We'll need to turn that set screw a couple of times, and if you just wiggle on the heater cartridge, you should be able to see it sliding back and forth. But do not pull the heater cartridge out until you've removed the small Phillips head screw that's holding the thermistor in place on the heater block. Now that we've got both of those screws out or loosened, we should be able to just pull the heater cartridge and thermistor out. For whatever reasoning, my heater cartridge was fit in very tightly, so I took a small Allen key and pushed it from the opposite side, which allowed me to pop the heater cartridge out. The tiny little thermistor bulb is incredibly delicate, so be very careful with it. You don't want to touch it with your fingers because the oils on your hands can also damage it. I recommend just placing it off to the side behind the X carriage for now. Now that we've got both the thermistor and the heater cartridge out of the old Hotend, we could remove the two screws that are holding it in place on that X carriage. We won't be needing anything else from the old Hotend except for a little bit of the PTFE tube, so just keep it off to the side for now. I also went ahead and threw it behind the X-axis with the existing fan shroud, thermistor, and heater cartridge. The next step is to remove the belts from the current X carriage back plate. To do this, we'll start by loosening the belts by turning the knob counterclockwise on the right-hand side of the printer, which will give our belts some slack, making this much easier to do. When you feel like you've got enough slack, you can just grab the ends of the belts that are attached to that back plate, and if you just pull them towards the back of it, they will pop right off, and we'll just leave them hanging off to the sides for now. With the belts removed, we're now ready to loosen the bolts that are holding the roller wheels in place. To do this, we'll need to grab an Allen key for the front side, but we won't be able to just turn it because there are nylon lock nuts on all three of those bolts on the back side of the machine. So we'll need to grab either an adjustable wrench or a spanner wrench, which is what I'm using, to hold those in place while we turn the bolts on the front. I'm not going to be completely removing the bolts, I'll just start by loosening them one by one. And once you've got enough play, you can actually just pivot that plate forward and it will pop right off of the aluminum extrusion. Once we've got the back plate off, I'm going to continue and remove the bolts from all of the roller wheels. The reason for this is that we are going to be using these 3 roller wheels with the new micro Swiss extruder, so we do need them off completely. As far as all of the bolts and the eccentric nut and the lock nuts and everything else, we don't need any of that stuff, so we can just put it off to the side. The only thing that we are going to be using are those 3 wheels. Now we will turn our attention to the existing extruder because we will be removing it as well as the extruder motor. Starting off with the adjustment knob, if you wiggle that back and forth while pulling upward, it'll pop right off. And the first screw we'll remove is the one for the extruder tension. Once you've got that fully removed, you can grab the spring, and if you pull it towards you, it should pop right out, which will make it easier to remove the screw that's holding the tension arm in place. Once you loosen that screw, you can pull up and the tension arm will pop out along with that screw. To remove the Bowden tube, we'll start by pulling the little blue retention clip, and then if you push the fitting towards the extruder, you can then pull the Bowden tubing out and just leave it off to the side before unplugging the current cable for the extruder stepper motor. There are 3 screws left that will also need to be removed, and when you get down to the last screw, use one hand to hold the stepper motor in place so that it doesn't fall off the printer. With that last screw removed, we can also pull the plastic extruder housing off of its mounting point and remove it completely. There's probably a couple of zip ties holding the Bowden tubing to the wire harness, so we'll take some flush cutters and snip those off, which will then allow us to completely remove the Hotend and Bowden tubing to set off to the side. The last thing we'll need from the old printer assembly are the 2 fans. If you followed along earlier, you should have already removed the 1 screw holding the blower fan in place, but there is a secondary screw that's a little bit further in towards the bottom that we'll need to remove as well. Once you've loosened that screw, if you pull on the blower fan, it'll slide out of its little cubby that it has inside of the housing, and you can place it off to the side. Next, for the hot end fan, it has 2 Phillips head screws that we'll need to remove in order to be able to pull that out of the housing. We won't be reusing these screws as well, so you don't need to keep them. You can put them off to the side or get rid of them. On the blower fan, there is a little fan shroud that is attached to it by 2 tiny little Phillips head screws. We need to unscrew those, and then once you've done that, if you pull on that fan shroud, it'll just pop right off of the opening in the fan. What you should have at this point is a wire harness that has a blower fan, a hot end cooling fan, your thermistor, and your heater cartridge. Now we'll grab the new extruder body, and we'll need to remove the fan shroud that comes pre-installed, so that way we can get access to the body itself and install the roller wheels. To do this, we'll need to remove the 2 screws that come pre-installed. One of them is going to be on the top right, and the other one is on the left side next to the stepper motor or the BL Touch housing. When you do pull off this fan shroud and those 2 screws, be very careful not to lose them because we will be needing them to reinstall in just a moment here, so place them off to the side but not too far away. Now we're ready to install the rollers on the new extruder body. To do this, we'll grab the bag of hardware that has a long bolt, 2 shorter bolts, a washer, a nylon lock nut, and the eccentric nut. We'll start off by grabbing the 1 long bolt and pushing it through one of the roller wheels, followed by the eccentric nut. Make sure that you're following the orientation in the video. The longer portion, or the longer boss as it's called, needs to be facing away from the roller wheel. Once you've got that, we'll push it through the opening in the extruder body down where the belt attachment point is, and then we'll need to place the washer as well as the nylon lock nut on top of that bolt. Just like we did earlier when we removed the old roller wheels, we'll need to grab either an adjustable wrench or a spanner wrench for the nylon lock nut, and then we'll grab an Allen key for the other side and tighten it in place. You want to make sure that it is nice and tight. Now, I recommend prepping these other 2 roller wheels. To do that, all we're going to do is take the 2 smaller bolts that have thread locker and we'll push them through those roller wheels. Then we'll turn the printer around and take the extruder body and place it up against the X extrusion. The reason why we prepped those screws and the wheels is so that way it's easier while you're using one hand to hold this in place to grab them and thread the bolts into the main body. In my case, it was very difficult to line those wheels up because of how tight things were, So if you get the little spanner wrench, you can actually turn the eccentric nut that is on the first bolt we installed, and it'll give you a lot more slack, making it much easier to get those last 2 wheels installed. Once you've got everything lined up, tighten those top 2 wheels, and because we had loosened that eccentric nut, you're going to have a little bit of slop, which is completely fine. What we'll do as a final note is grab that spanner wrench one more time, and we'll need to adjust the eccentric nut a little bit to make sure we don't have any play in our extruder body. With the new extruder body on the carriage, we can now reinstall the belts. For the side that has 2 slots, the Ender 3v2 needs to go on the inside. Depending on the printer that you're installing this onto, you might have a longer gantry or not as much belt, so depending on the printer, you might need to use the outside slot. Now we can use the knob on the right hand side to add the tension back to the belts. Now we're going to install the heater block onto the extruder body. One nice thing is that the nozzle and heat brake come torqued to spec. If you do swap the nozzle, make sure to heat the Hotend up to 235 Celsius before you loosen or tighten the nozzle to avoid damaging or stripping any of the threads. To install, we'll just place the heat brake into the slot on the bottom of the extruder body. Do your best to make sure it's pressed all the way up into the extruder body, and then we'll tighten the 1 set screw into the heat brake, which will secure everything in place. Mind the orientation, as the heater cartridge should be on the front side facing towards you. The set screw needs to be snug, but be careful not to strip it because it is a very small screw. In the same bag as the heater block, we'll find the new thermistor screw. So we'll need to grab the wiring harness and make sure you pull it over the aluminum extrusion, otherwise you will run into issues. This is going to be installed on the bottom out of the 2 small vertical holes, and you want to make sure that you have the thermistor as far into that cavity as you possibly can to make sure you've got accurate readings. In my instance, there was some Kapton tape holding the heater cartridge and thermistor together that I removed. It just made it much easier to maneuver these things around. Once I got the end of the thermistor into the cavity it's going into, I used my fingers to push it all the way in, and then I split the wires up a little bit to make sure that I could push the thermistor screw in place without damaging those wires by pushing on them too much. I turned it a couple of times to make sure that it was in there and threaded, and then I used my hands to pinch those wires and just make sure that they're actually underneath the head of the screw, so that way when I tighten this, it is holding the thermistor in place. It is important to note that you want this to be snug but not tight. The leads or the wires for the thermistor are incredibly delicate, so do not put too much force into it. With the thermistor in place, we can then insert the heater cartridge, which is a lot less delicate, and there are 2 small screws on the bottom of the heater block that we'll need to tighten in order to clamp this down. You can definitely apply a bit more force to this, as again, the heater cartridge is just not nearly as sensitive as that really delicate thermistor. Now that we've got everything in place, we'll install the silicone sock. It's a little bit tight in the back, so you kind of have to angle it, but you should have no issues getting it, and once you do, it fits very nicely on the heater block. Now we can take our new fan shroud, and I dump out the 2 screws. We'll need them in just a moment, so make sure you put them off to the side, but I was worried about dropping them on the floor. And take the bag that has the 8 self-tapping screws. There are 2 different sizes, 4 of them will be larger than the other 4, and we'll start off with the 4 smaller ones, which is what we'll need to attach the blower fan or the layer cooling fan to the fan shroud. As far as the blower fan goes, there's only one direction it can really go, which is with the opening going into the slot on the right side of the fan shroud. It should slot in very nicely. It's actually a quite snug fit. And then taking those 4 self-tapping screws, we will tighten the fan into the printed part. You need it to be nice and snug, but again, we're threading into plastic, so there's absolutely no need to over torque these fans. As long as it's sitting there and it is tight, then you are good to go. Once that's in place, we'll take the 4 larger screws and the heatsink cooling fan, and we'll place that on the front of this fan shroud. Make sure that the wires are facing towards the top right direction. Then we'll just rinse and repeat what we just did. All the same things apply. You want it nice and tight, but you are threading into plastic, so remember that there is no need to torque these fans in place as they are very, very light, and there is not a whole lot of chance of them popping out as long as things are at least snug. Now we're going to take a little bit of Bowden tubing from our old Hotend. I did roughly 50 to 60 millimeters, and this is just a guide tube. It doesn't have to be exact by any means, so just cut off a piece and you can always cut it shorter if you need to later on. This is just going to make it easier for the filament to get from the filament holder into the extruder. Once you've got that piece, press it into the top of the extruder housing into the Bowden fitting, and we'll take this little retention clip that is included and just push it underneath the top of the Bowden fitting. This will make sure that our guide tube isn't able to back out or pop out of its housing. Now we can take the 2 screws from our new fan shroud, and we are going to be installing the fan shroud to the main body. At this point, I recommend taking both sets of the fan wires as well as the thermistor and heater cartridge and kind of bundling them together. You want to pull them on the inside of the fan shroud, and if you just sort of use your hand to group them together, we'll add some zip ties in a moment, but it'll really help with the cable management. Then just align the fan shroud with the aluminum body and take those 2 screws and secure it in place. Now we will take the included stepper motor extension cable and plug that into the extruder motor. Make sure that you use the included one. I was told that because of the way the pinout is, if you use a different one, you risk damaging either the stepper motor or the main board itself. We are now ready to do some cable management, and I just took a couple of small zip ties. I started off and tightened the cable cover inside of the fan housing or shroud to sort of keep everything together. Then I took a few more zip ties and I followed the wire cover with the stepper motor extension cable. Make sure to give the stepper motor extension cable a little bit of slack like you can see I did here, just to make sure we're not putting any unnecessary strain on the plug or the motor itself. And then just follow up the wire harness with a couple of zip ties, and it really helps to clean everything up, keep everything together, and prevent any wires from snagging on anything in the future. Now, turning the printer around, we can plug in the other end of the extruder extension cable to the existing plug. There was quite a bit of extra slack, so on mine, I just went ahead and sort of bundled it all together, and then took a couple of zip ties to also attach that to the one wire wrap or the wire cover. To clean things up, I used the opening in the old extruder mounting point, and I attached the whole wire loom or wires to that. The one thing you do want to make sure before you secure things is that you're not limiting, or there's no strain that's put on the X carriage. So what I did was just took it and I moved it all the way to the max point it could be at, and there was plenty of slack in my cable. So just confirm that to avoid any accidents later on. If you are using the stock filament spool holder that's facing towards the back, you'll probably want to loosen the T-nuts holding that in place and just spin it around so the filament is on the front side since you have a direct drive extruder. As far as tensioning the extruder goes, there is a knob on the front, and Microswiss let me know that roughly 1.75 millimeters of exposed threads is what you want for stiff filaments like PLA, PTG, or ABS. And if you're printing with something like TPU, you'll want to unthread it a little bit to give your TPU a little less tension. Now we're ready to plug in the power supply and turn on our printer. Before we do any actual printing though, there's a few things we need to do, like update the E-steps. Microswiss did provide a G-code file that I'll have linked as well that will update it to the 400 steps per millimeter. We'll just need to drag that onto a micro SD card or an SD card and plug it into our printer, and then navigate to that file. It'll be listed, it's a G-code file, so it'll be listed like any other print that you'd normally print. It takes just a second or two and it'll update the E-steps on your printer. With the stock Ender 3 V2 firmware, the E-steps are not written to EEPROM. It's actually saved to the micro SD card, so every time you turn on the Ender 3 V2 with this firmware, you must make sure that same micro SD card is in the printer, otherwise it will revert back to the factory E-step value. It's also recommended to do a quick bed leveling. Even if the nozzle just shifted a tiny little bit up or down, you don't want to damage your bed, so before you run a print, just check your four corners to make sure that you're good to go. In the slicer, you'll need to change the retraction distance to 1 millimeter. The stock profile for the V2 was set to 5, and then they had the retraction speed set to 60 millimeters a second. I went ahead and changed this to 35 millimeters a second, and I've had really good results so far. I hope that you enjoyed this video and that you've successfully installed your NG extruder, or at least have a much better understanding of the process. Additional steps you may want to consider are running a PID tune, which I can have links in the description of this video on how to do that process, as well as increasing the max temp of your 3D printer. Just about all of the Creality and Ender 3 style clone printers come with a hard cap of 255 to 265 Celsius for the extruder max temp. And the reason they have this is because the stock hot end on these machines is PTFE line, and going above that point will destroy the hot end. However, with the all-metal hot end in the NG extruder, this temp can now be increased to 300 Celsius. The process of doing this will vary based off the printer you have as well as the board, but if you do have an Ender 3 V2, I highly recommend taking a look at the Gyres firmware, which we covered in a previous video on the channel. I will also have some relevant information linked in the description of this video for anyone that is interested in increasing their max temp that will help you with the editing and compiling of Marlin firmware. On that note, don't forget to like and subscribe for more great videos. We make a video every single week, so there's always fresh content coming your way. And if you do want to support the channel furthermore, I'll have links down below in the description over to our Patreon, where there are some really awesome rewards. Huge thank you to all of our existing Patreon supporters. I appreciate each and every one of you, allowing me to come back every single week and spend more time doing what I love, which is making content for you all to enjoy. On that note, this has been Daniel from ModBot, and I look forward to seeing you guys in my next video. Peace, guys.